Hey guys, it's Vince. Today in this video we are going to be taking a look at a second-hand system that's for sale that a potential client contacted me about in regards to a consultation because again he wants to make sure that his investment is sound. I've been getting a lot of these lately and I wanted to do a video on this because again we know that a lot of systems are being now offered online. There's different venues from Craigslist to eBay. Could be an actual automation auction. Those are all over the place now. And what usually happens is the seller will usually have the enclosure lid on the controller and everything looks sound. You know, you'll see the system which probably hasn't been used in some time and it's collecting dust. It might have a little wear, but overall they tell you the same thing. Hey, everything looks great. That's fine and dandy. The only issue is we don't know what's going on inside the controller. Well, this potential client was very intelligent in the fact that he requested the seller to take the lid off and actually asked him if he would take the lid off, and he actually did. He said, I'll send you pictures of it with the lid off and you can make a determination of what you think. And of course he forwarded me over the pictures to get a second opinion. And again, I wanted to do this video because I feel there's a lot to learn here, and everybody that knows me will usually say, man, your attention to detail is usually spot on. Well, there's a reason, because I know that when we're buying anything used, when we're buying anything in the robotic genre, everything is details. And the more you're doing this, the more you're going to find out that these details are always the ones that, number one, are the most costly, and number two, the one that bites you the hardest. So let's look at this together, and hopefully I can save at least one of you some headaches, especially in enough education that you'll get from this to at least ask certain questions. So of course we're looking at the front of the system here. We've got our typical mushroom e-stop, got some LEDs here. But what I really want you guys to pay attention to is I zoom in. Okay, now again he just sent these pictures. Thank God he sent pictures in really good high def. You can see we've got some ports that are cut in the front of the enclosure. And what I want you to pay close attention to is you can see that this port isn't matched up exactly. Okay, something here is off. You can see it's not lined up. Could be the angle of the picture. That's potential. But if we look here at the cut, it doesn't look sound. It doesn't look like it's machine done in terms of a robot or in terms of at least, you know, punch out paneling. These look really rough over here. Okay, not such a big deal. Something to pay attention to. Once again, just gives us the determination of what we're dealing with as far as manufacturer. Coming over here on this DB15 connector, this is where things start getting interesting. You can see that we've got some discoloration on the jack nuts of this connector. Now, what is that discoloration from? Well, many of you already know that if you expose electronics to humidity over a set of time, you're going to see that you're going to get oxidation forming, and that's exactly what we have forming on these DB9 jack nuts. Now, that oxidation, you say, well, you know, every shop is usually that isn't climate controlled is going to have some amount of humidity. Well, that's true, but we also know that exposing our electronics that are sensitive to humidity is going to depreciate them in a much, much larger format in terms of overall lifespan, on top of the fact that that corrosion can also go inside these pins and give you all kinds of issues. So again, it's something that should be looked at carefully, because again, if it's already on the exterior portion of the system, you know it's going to be penetrating the internal portion of the system as well. So now that we've covered the front, not too much to see here. I don't know why we have two holes punched here exactly. I don't know what that's about, but they are present. Let's see what we've got here. We'll go to the next picture. Now you can see we're inside the enclosure. Again, I've actually gone through and I removed any names of anything that would distribute the manufacturer. Again, this is a complete example that will be completely unbiased in terms of not here to sway you from purchasing a certain vendor system, but I am here to point out the spot the knots, because believe me, there's quite a few in this system. And what's really interesting is a lot of people look at this and say, you know what, this looks great as far as assembly. It's very organized. They use ribbon connectors going to your drivers. Here's your main board right here. Here's our power supply. But there is some significant issues when you start using ribbon cables in this format with drivers. And the biggest issue you're going to find is the fact that these are not filtered in any way. Okay, they do sell ferrites for ribbon cables that you can buy to filter these cables. If there isn't a ferrite installed, and even though these are short cable runs, you are still dealing with possible signal interference due to the fact that there is no shielding on any of these cables. Okay, so again, we're going from the motherboard, going over to the drive, and if we lose signal at all, if any of these signals are corrupt, you're going to have problems. What you're basically looking at here is problems waiting to happen. Now, I don't know if this particular unit gave the actual seller any issues. And of course, I'm going to be quite honest with you. The odds of you ever knowing that, truthfully, you're never going to get the direct answer. Most people will say, hey, you know what, we haven't used it, but when we did, everything was great. Well, we've all heard that, and unfortunately, we all have the potential as humans to lie. So the question here is how much truth you're going to be told. Be realistic. Okay, many of you already are stating the obvious to yourself, in that you're looking for a cooling fan and you don't see one present, and you're absolutely right. That's another definitive red flag. We do see we have a giant heatsink here, or what appears to be a larger heatsink than our actual drives. However, the thing to keep into consideration, I get asked this question a lot, if I use a large heatsink, is that enough? The thing you have to keep in mind is that your power supply, in this particular instance, this power supply does not have an internal cooling fan, and we can tell because we're using a mesh type design, and I sell power supplies with the mesh type design, which once again is open like that because they're assuming that when you mount this power supply, you have a proper CFM mounted cooling fan in the electronics enclosure. In this particular instance, you don't, which means you're basically condensing all of the heat once you place the lid back on this enclosure. In all fairness, we don't know if in the top lid we actually have a cooling fan mounted. However, what we see here is a definitive rule against best practice. A cooling fan must be present in any electronics enclosure optimally, especially when we're dealing with anything dealing with stability. And in this case, an overheating system can easily cause a lot of stability issues, so pay close attention. The other thing that stands out immediately is we got a relay here, and coming over here, we've got a lead coming in with a crimp connector with two leads coming in. That's not best practice either. Okay, and as we go through this, the thing that stands out the most, we look at these ribbon cables, and I've already pointed out they're not filtered. Everything in this controller is not filtered. We don't know, these are for LEDs, not such a big deal, but if we come over here and we look for any grounds, we're not really seeing any grounds associated other than what plugs into the board here, and I'm assuming this green lead here as it comes over, which once again, it's interesting because we're coming over to, it looks like a port of some sort. I believe it looks like an RCA jack, and we'll go over to another picture and we'll see this later on as we go through the forensics of this. But you can definitively see we have two wires coming in here. And we also see that these are not insulated with any type of heat shrink tubing, which is completely incorrect and should be corrected immediately. You can see here this unit does have heat sink supplied. You've got a heat sink, or at least a mounting platform on the board. I know that this is a heat sink for a fact on these drives. That is actually best practice. The only thing I see here that is a huge red flag is the fact that we do not see any type of shielded cabling going to our drives. Or, for that matter, like I said, I would highly recommend using, and the company could have implemented this very cheaply. Their engineers, if they have real engineers, they could have implemented a ribbon cable ferrite for each one of these drives on both ends, and I guarantee you that would have did a massive job on the filtering that's not present currently. So the next thing we're going to do, we'll go to the next unit. Now we see an overhead of the drives. And again, same thing, we're looking basically at where the leads are coming from. As we come in here, it looks like just a wire crossing over. Wire management, not too big of a deal because, again, they're using ribbon cables. It keeps everything generally pretty neat. Now we're getting over to the power supply area, okay? Once again, as I pointed out before, and you can see this clearly, now this green lead here is kind of in the way right now. But underneath that, if we look, that's one of those, I believe it's an RCA jack. And you can see we've got a bare terminal just like we've got here where it's not insulated. This is not best practice. Every terminal must be properly insulated, okay? Whether or not it's powering anything, whether or not it's carrying a signal is irrelevant. This, under best practice, should always be properly insulated with the proper heat shrink, and that would be rated to whatever voltage we're going to assess is actually required for this application. Now, I can tell you definitively that in the event, and this is why I always say this, because guys will say to me, well, you know, that's really picky, there's no voltage potentially going to this. Bottom line is this: if you ever have a home fire or a building fire and the fire marshal does an investigation for your insurance company, which will be done if you have insurance, which most of us do, and they find that the box or the enclosure or whatever starts the fire in that particular instance is started, and they do any type of forensics on it and they find out that anything is not properly insulated, you are in very, very, very high risk of not being paid by your insurance company. So I'm telling you right now, they have every right to ask them, where did you get this enclosure? What is it? They'll go down the whole rabbit hole, and believe you me, you better have every T crossed and I dotted with the correct information, because they'll validate it, and guess what? If it doesn't come back right, you're done. If the company you purchased it from did not follow specs as to what's to be done electrically, you're going to have problems. You can see here again, we have on this power supply, which is a Meanwell, very good brand. Everything here looks good as far as terminals, but I want you to pay close attention as we zoom in. Once again, we've got live, okay, so this is hot. We've got a single terminal here being used twice. This is not best practice, and it's unsafe. We've got another terminal here for ground also being used twice. Proper best practice would be using a terminal splitter. Once again, you would take this one terminal, split it to a terminal with multiple output, so the one lead would go over here to the terminal splitter, and then you would have allocation to the multiple leads that would be required for this terminal. You've seen my systems in the past, and that is what happens. You can see it also here on the neutral. I cannot believe, matter of fact, you can even see a lot of the casing is still exposed. All of these leads should be bottomed out properly if they're going to be used inside these terminals. That's for safety. Okay, so again, guys, we can see some corners cut, and I really want you guys to pay close attention to that, especially my guys looking at plasma systems, because these are the systems that just do not have tolerance for this. Okay, when we see stuff like this, aside from safety, again, which I can't believe many guys would do that, but when we look at this, this is a definitive no-no. Okay, and what it really is two factors. It's either going to be money factor, because they don't want to spend the money to hire the right engineers to do it right. That's number one. Or number two, it's going to be laziness. And I hope laziness is not the key, because really installing the proper terminal splitters is really going to take it to a new level. Now, that being said, if you guys have seen my new Rev 2 power supply, I really want you guys to look at that. On this power supply, I believe we only have two. My new power supplies are built with 10 output terminals for power. That means you have 10 for V negative and 10 for V positive. And this is the exact reason I did that, because this is the kind of stuff we usually see from a lot of vendors. They try to cut corners. It saves time, it saves money, but it's not correct practice. And again, for what it costs to put a terminal splitter in time is what usually degrades the system, because again, they're trying to, knock out as many of these as possible. But again, we see 2 leads going into live, 2 leads going into neutral, and 2 leads going into ground. When these are single point terminals, you should only be having 1 lead go into this at a time. So again, guys, pay attention to this. I drew this to the potential client's attention immediately, because again, when we see things like this, it usually crosses over into other areas. Okay, we can also see over here, I'm going to see if I can zoom in, there we go. We've got our typical spade connectors, which are press-on, and that's proper in this application, because again, on certain applications where removal or replacement is required, that would be an area to look at. Where a motherboard would be replaced, you could do this. Again, I don't ever recommend using crimp connectors for this, especially in a plasma system. It's always better to use solder and flux the right way and use the spade connector. It'll do the same process, but you're assured the proper connection. When we're using crimp connectors, we really never know. And again, you're at the mercy of the seller to give you the proper feedback as far as, hey, you know what? You're selling the system. Do you ever have any issues with it? Well, no, I never had any issues with it. So like I covered before, we got to always think about that. Okay, so here is the rear of the system now, and as we've talked about, we already see the RCA jacks. You have an optional expansion port, which I have to say, this is a little comical. They actually put a sticker over it. Why not just put in an additional DB9 connector and fill that port and then leave it as an expansion block port that if someone wanted to expand the system, they could just go with it. You know, I mean, what are we talking about here with money? And again, this is the area I want you guys to pay attention to, because it sounds like you're being nitpicky, but really what I'm trying to show is that for the small amount of investment for a company to make to do this correctly, it doesn't make sense logically. You just stick a sticker over it. Okay, I mean, really, a DB9 connector is pennies on the dollar, and especially if you're buying them in bulk, to put that in there, your client's going to be happier. Pay to have some silk screening done or have graphics done properly. That's really just nitpick stuff. But if we look at these jack nuts again, you cannot deny what I've said before. We see that we have oxidation on them. So we know that this system has been exposed to the elements. Another key point here is we've got the auxiliary 110 volt input, which is actually installed backwards. Not sure what that was for. We do have a nice IEC port with built-in fuse protection, which is great. It's got the switch on the back. That's, you know, everything there looks good. But this I'm kind of curious about is why this was done. Potentially because the only thing I could think is that maybe inside the box they were worried about room. And that could definitely have made the assembler or technician really think about, oh, well, you know what, the easiest way to fix this is just invert it. And that's exactly what they did. So again, we see some issues here. We have no idea what these ports are. RCA jacks, again, we have no grounds coming in from this. So if this is a signal at all, either one of these, you can't ground these ports. They're not designed for that. So again, you're already dealing with some red flags, major red flags. Mainly, of course, these ribbon cables, which we've already identified that are not filtered for our drives. We see some issues here. And I just, like I said, I'll let the potential client know this is something to think about, you know. And this happens a lot. And again, it's not always the fact that the end user who's selling the system is malicious or just trying to make a quick dollar. Sometimes they really don't know. I mean, they themselves don't know, and then they list it thinking, hey, you know what, I'm just going to give somebody a good deal or whatever, and, you know, maybe they didn't use it a lot, but they didn't know what they bought, and they're passing on a problem that, you know, is really based on the incompetence that they first had, and they pass it on to someone else, and it can be traumatic because, again, depending on how much money is being spent, somebody is buying this hopefully to start a business, hopefully to, you know, generate some revenue, or even if it's a hobby, whatever it may be at that given moment, they're going to be heartbroken if they're going to have problems, because then what usually happens is they can't go back and, you know, discuss. If they buy it on Craigslist, if they buy it from an automation auction, you know, you're pretty much SOL once you leave the door. If you go on eBay, at least you have some clout as far as getting in touch with the seller. But these are things to really, really pay attention to. And again, this was a pretty simple system. Internally, it looks like the company actually spent some money to do the motherboard and all that. I can tell you right now, most companies do that because it's much easier for them to make money because, of course, they can tell you, hey, you know, replace the board. And if you replace the board, you know, God only knows what they're going to charge you for the board, and then they'll charge you individually for the drives. It's common sense. You know, they could do an integrated drive like a G540, but doing it this way, it's much easier to piece out and charge you, you know, double, triple than just doing an integrated drive. And that's why, again, G540 is still my top seller for that reason, because it makes things super simple. But again, as we go through this and we've seen everything, you really get a breakdown as far as what we're looking at. Once again, on this actual portion of the board, you can see your motors allocation. We look in here, it says motor 1, motor 2, motor 3. Not too much to go here. Spade connectors, crimp connectors. The port cutouts, like I said, not too much to say. I mean, these are the LEDs that are coming in. Just a question, I guess you can expand it. That's what that's doing with we've already seen on the front with the DB9s, or I should say on the rear of the enclosure for the DB9s. But again, really simple. Just some areas that really should be taken care of. And in terms of at least looking at this, if this potential client is serious about purchasing it, the first thing I would do is do the ferrites on these ribbon cables. That would require him rebuilding these, because these ends would have to be removed in order to put them on, unless I believe they do sell the ribbon filters that actually snap open, in which case he could just snap them on, hope for the best. Again, the biggest concern here is why they'd be running a motherboard type apparatus instead of just building the drives on the board. But like I said, I believe it has more to do with the fact that in terms of proprietary hardware, it's much easier to have them make extra money when they're selling the board on top of the drives. So again, guys, you've seen a complete breakdown. And like I said, looking at all these details is imperative. It looks like we have a black lead barely even making contact here. I don't know what's going on here. It's already got the casing fully exposed. So you can see here where we're definitely trying to get things done as quick as possible. But again, I hope that this video has been helpful. If you guys are looking at a used system, if you're wondering, you know, is there really going to be a huge savings? I get guys that think about that all the time. You know, I could buy a new system, but I could buy this used system. And man, it's a pro system. Everything looks good. The guy hasn't used it. He's told me great things. I met him on Facebook Marketplace. And, you know, what do I do? You know, do I do this or do I not do this? And usually a Google search ensues, and hopefully they find my channel and then they'll message me. And in this particular instance, the seller was able to, or I should say the potential buyer was able to get the seller to open up the enclosure, and that's fantastic, because I feel like then the seller is definitely trying to, you know, do justice in terms of the sale and try to keep things fair. And I think that's totally honest. It's no different than you buying a car and asking, you know, the seller to open and lift the hood up. No different than that. But looking at this, these are just the areas that I would point out. And again, things for you guys to pay attention to. As you go to look at systems anywhere, look at everything in detail. If you see cables that look like they've been manipulated, you know, in this particular instance, and I tell guys this all the time, when you see cables not fully inserted, even though it looks like a real petty thing, it can mean a couple things. It can mean that this cable was serviced. It could mean that whoever assembled the enclosure didn't insert this properly. It didn't skin the actual lead properly at the proper depth to insert it in the terminal. Happens all the time. And usually when that happens, it's due to speed. They're worried about how many of them they can get done, how fast they can turn them out. They're under a deadline, they're under a crunch, or they're selling systems, happens all the time, per order. Okay, and when I say per order, I do that myself, but I also work on my systems. I don't have 10 guys working for me. So sometimes what ends up happening, you'll get 10, 15 orders in at once, and what typically ends up happening is, instead of staging a proper amount of lead time for each build, they'll try to do as many as possible, bank as much money as possible, and get them done as fast as possible, and that's when these type of things happen. So you really don't know what caused this, okay? But is it correct? No, it's not correct, and it's not safe. So again, paying attention to the details, at least so you know and you're aware of it, to me that means everything. Then at least you know you're making an educated choice with your investment. So again, guys, I hope the video has been helpful. I hope it's helped, you know, at least one of you, especially as you guys, you know, peruse online and try to find the best deal. Everybody's looking for one. Again, this potential client, I don't know what his actual judgment is on this system yet. We covered a lot of things, but whether he moves forward or doesn't move forward, at least now he knows the truth. And I do applaud this seller for actually sending him pictures of the system once again with the lid off. I think that's a real stand-up thing to do. So again, guys, if you do have questions, quotes, require quotes, consultations, whatever it may be, you'll see my contact email in the beginning of the video and at the end. It's storm2313@gmail.com. You can also contact me through my eDealers store on eBay, eDealers Direct, and either way, whichever is easier for you. Once again, I thank you all for support. Take care.